good to be with you this morning. If you will, open your Bibles to Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13 is where we'll begin this morning. We have spent the past couple weeks talking about the church and our relationship to the church. We've begun there in Acts chapter 2 to mention that God adds us to the church. There's a big movement of people who want spirituality without any church involvement. And it was God's design from the very beginning to add Christians to the church. And so we talked a couple weeks ago about the idea of our attitude towards the church and how that's going to affect our actions towards the church. And then last week we talked about our relationship, that God has designed it so that we have older women and older men who are mothers and fathers to us. And we have younger women and younger men who are brothers and sisters to us. And our relationship, because there's a deep spiritual bond with Christ, we must have a good relationship with others. And so looking here in Romans chapter 13, today we're going to talk about the topic of responsibility. With great power comes great responsibility, for all those who know that statement. What our privileges and our blessings that come along with being a part of the church, there is responsibility that is ingrained in those things. That I have a responsibility towards you as the congregation, as part of my brothers and my sisters, as part of my mothers and my fathers, that I can't just have all the blessings and not have to give anything back. And it's interesting, as you kind of look through the New Testament, you're going to have a hard time finding an attitude that is portrayed of what do I get out of this. And it's almost always, if not always, an attitude of what can I give. And so here in Romans chapter 13, Paul has been dealing with what is the consequences of the gospel. And by consequences, I mean if all of these things are true. Paul has been laying out this kind of really elegant argument from chapters 1 through 11 that God saved us. Not because of works done by us, but because of His grace. That He's orchestrated that our sins could be removed and that we could have a harmony and fellowship with Him. And that both Jews and Gentiles, that God has called all nations to Himself to worship Him. And then starting in chapter 12 is the consequences. If all these things are true, if God has made you in Him to be a Christian, then what do you have to do? And if you notice here in chapter 13, the first thing I want to point out is here in verse 8. He says, "Owe no one anything except to love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the command, you shall not commit adultery, that you should not murder, you should not steal, you should not covet, and any other commandment is summed up in this word, that you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law." And verse 8 is not a complete prohibition against the idea of taking out loans from somebody else. But it's the idea of when it comes to my responsibility, how do I view my approach to somebody else? And the way that he phrases it there in verse 8 is to owe no one anything except to love. Now, love is an act of will. That's how the Bible describes love. And while there is certainly romantic elements between a husband and a wife, there is familial elements between father and child, mother and child, and siblings, that true love, as given by God, is an act of will, that I'm going to do something for somebody else because they are more important or as important as myself. And he phrases it this way in verse 8, that we get to view one another with the expectation that we owe them love. It's a really different way of looking at it. Not, well, if you do something, then I will show love in return. It is, I'm always in your debt. And if I pay and I pay and I pay out love, then tomorrow, whenever a new day dawns, I still owe you some love. And whenever I paid and paid and paid out love, even if you do not reciprocate, that's one of the harder things about the gospel, is the idea that I have to be long-suffering and gentle and kind, and I have to be loving, even when nobody else is in return. There's a really interesting question that comes up at the beginning of Job, to chase a small rabbit trail for a second. The question comes up, would Job serve you for nothing? And that's a really legitimate question. Would Job be someone who would be willing to serve God, even if everything in his life was in the exact opposite direction? Instead of everything being good, if everything was negative in his life, would he still serve God for nothing? And we get to see this kind of in the concept of Christianity. Would we serve God even if nothing is returned to us? And so in that regard, we look here in verse 8, to owe no one anything except for love. Now, this isn't the first time that Paul has brought this up in the book of Romans. And if you back up into chapter 12, verse 9 and verse 10, we'll find these two verses. He says, let love be genuine. And the idea of genuine love is the concept we were looking at before, that if you love someone only as a reciprocation for the actions that they've done to you, it's not genuine love. If you only love those who love you, that's not genuine love. If you only love others when things are going well in your life, that's not genuine love. Jesus describes genuine love back in Matthew chapter 5. You to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, and that you do good even when that is not returned. So Paul says here in Romans chapter 12 and verse 9, let love be genuine, abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good. Love one another with a brotherly affection, and outdo one another in showing honor. When it comes to my responsibilities to the church, I have to be purposeful in all the things that I do. I think that's what every Christian is. We live a life of purpose. That every interaction that we have is a purpose-driven interaction. It's not just a random chance. It's not just, well, this happened. We don't really get the excuse anymore of, well, they did something, so I did something in return, as you would a child. Well, they hit me first, and so I hit them back. And just to make sure they don't do it again, I hit them twice as hard, just to make sure. And yet, that's how oftentimes we live our life. Well, they did this, and therefore I did this in return. And he says that whenever it comes to our interactions with other people, we are purposeful on how we do that. That I'm going to let love be genuine, and I'm going to outdo someone else in showing honor. And then in chapter 13, verse 8, I'm going to owe you love. That every time I get to interact with you, that it's going to be something that should be on my mind of how can I show love today. And that's a big deal. And that's a revolutionary idea for how people in the world view our relationships. Turn with me to Galatians chapter 6. Now, as we go through just the four main passages we'll talk about this morning, they can be overwhelming at first because they're very broad verses. Romans 13, verse 8, to owe no one anything except for love. That is a huge debt. A debt that is going to constantly be paid and never be paid off. And then here in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10, it's another very large commandment that comes along with my responsibility in the church. He says here in verse 10, so then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, but especially to those of the household of faith. And there again is that same idea of purposefulness, that I'm going to pre-think about what I'm going to do good for somebody else. Now, the topic comes up again of, would we serve God for nothing? If no one reciprocated, if we didn't get anything in return, if no one ever thought, oh man, can I do Chad something good, would I still be willing to do good for them? And that's kind of the crux of the issue. Of how many times do we think of individuals here in the church that I'm going to purposely do good for? That he tells us, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, but especially the household of faith. That my thoughts, it should be a kind of a general, continual thought of how can I do good for somebody. But I'd be hard-pressed to not think doubly so of the Christians that I get to interact with on a regular basis. And kind of looking back a couple verses, back in verse 2, he gives us some idea of what some of those good things could be. He says in verse 2, to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. For me to do good in your life, I need to be around you. I need to have a relationship with you that happens more than just here on Sundays and here on Wednesdays. I have to know what are your burdens in verse 2 and have opportunity to do that. And as great as worship services are, and they primarily are worship services to worship God. And for me to be able to bear your burdens or to do good, those things happen outside of the bounds of these four walls. But those things are purposeful. That is my responsibility. There's a really neat psychological principle. I learned about it in the book Tipping Point, if anyone's ever interested. Interesting book. that the more people there are around a particular situation, the less likely anybody is to engage in that situation. And they gave a really interesting example of a woman who was chased through the streets of New York City, broad daylight, and then was murdered on the streets. And nobody came to help, even though hundreds of people saw what had happened. And the idea is that everyone thinks, well, someone else is going to be the person who calls 911, someone else is going to be the person who tries to intervene or to do good, to try to help in some way. And in that sense, here in Galatians chapter 6, that often happens with us. If we have a large group of 35 Christians, well, surely someone else is going to be the person who makes the phone call, or in our day and age, makes the text, or writes the email, or someone who else is going to show up at the door to do something for them. Someone else is going to have that relationship, and so we put it off because, well, someone else has that responsibility. It doesn't fall on my doorstep. And here in Galatians chapter 6, he puts it on my doorstep. That I have the responsibility to do good to everyone, and especially those of the household of faith. That my thought process is, it's not someone else's responsibility, it's my responsibility. By having that relationship with other Christians, by being brought into that family of Christ, by being bound together in one body, it is my responsibility to do good as often as is my opportunity. If you go over to Hebrews chapter 10, Hebrews chapter 10, starting there in verse 23, I think passages that we all know very well. He tells us there in verse 23, "Let us hold fast to the confession of our hope, without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. For if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sin, but a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy and the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much worse punishment do you suppose will be deserved by the one who has trampled underfoot the Son of God and has profaned the blood of his covenant by which you were sanctified and has outraged the Spirit of grace?" Sometimes we read verses 23 and 24 without the larger context of verses 26 down to verse 29. He says, "Let us hold fast our confession without wavering." That is going to be a lifelong pursuit, to hold on to something that we have confessed in our infancy of being a Christian. And there is going to be a lot of wind, so to speak, that is going to be buffeting us to waver from that. There's going to be a lot of opposition in our life. And it's going to be different opposition from one stage of our life to the next stage of our life, or sometimes even where we are geographically. And the combat to that, in verse 24, the way that we help ourselves with that is that we consider how to stir one another up to love and good works. That my stance as a Christian is going to be way harder if I don't have someone else constantly building me up. And in that regard, in verse 24, it's not the idea of how can I find someone else to build me up, but my responsibility is to find someone else to build up. That I need to consider how to stir one another up to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another all the more as you see the day drawing near. I have a responsibility to the congregation, to the church, to be a part of the church. And not neglect the meeting of one another, realizing that oftentimes whenever we make excuses to not be here, and I'm not saying sicknesses and illnesses, that it's just better that you not spread those things. But oftentimes the excuses turn into be a personal thing, that I don't think I, then fill in the blank. Or I don't want, fill in the blank. Or I feel, and then fill in the blank. And yet here in Hebrews chapter 10, when it comes to our meeting together, he puts the onus not on what you get out of it, but what you contribute. That's the idea of 1 Corinthians chapter 12, is that my responsibility of the body is not to say, well, I'm not important, and if I miss, I'm not lacking anything. The idea here in Hebrews chapter 10 is that purpose of whenever we come together, whenever I get to meet with other Christians, it should be for the purpose of stirring one another up to love and good works. Because we need to hold fast to our confession. And we can't do that very long as islands. If we are by ourselves, there's some point in time where we are going to break down under the pressure. That there's a reason that Elijah felt just so utterly alone, and God told him that he has saved hundreds of people left over to help build him up. Because as we look here, verses 26 down to verse 29, if we lose that confession, if we no longer hold fast to it, he makes the point here that there is a worse punishment that is deserved, a fearful expectation of judgment, and a fury of fire that will consume God's adversaries. So the question comes along, how long do you think that you can stay away from your responsibilities of building one another up in love and good works? It's not, the question here in the context is not how long can I stay away from being built up. And yet Paul makes the point, if you think that you stand, take heed lest you fall. The idea is, how long can I neglect my duties towards others to build them up to love and good works? If you go over to Ephesians chapter 4, all of these duties and responsibilities kind of seem to blend together to some degree as we look at these four passages. But here in Ephesians chapter 4, we're going to look at just another aspect of it. He makes the point in the beginning of chapter 4, it's this passage of the 7 ones, that together we are to have this unity of the Spirit and this bond of peace. And he describes the church, starting in verse 11, that he has given them apostles and prophets and evangelists and the shepherds and the teachers for the purpose of equipping the saints to the work of the ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ, until we all obtain the unity of faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, so that we are no longer children who are tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning and by craftiness and deceitful schemes. But notice here in verse 15, rather, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ, and from whom the whole body, when that is joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love. And there in verse 16 is kind of the crux of it, is that we are to build ourselves up in love. And if that is part of my responsibilities to the church, what happens if I neglect that? What if I say, as we looked at 1 Corinthians chapter 12, that, well, because I don't do this particular job, I'm not really a part of the body. I'm not really that useful. He makes a point in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 that God has so arranged the body, that God has given you your abilities so that you can do something that is unique. So the question comes up as we kind of look, not figuratively look around you. Feel free to look around you want. What people have we been neglecting when it comes to our responsibilities? Have there been people that you haven't reached out to lately? And just speaking very frankly about the work here at Colonial, I think we know that there are some people who tend to be here and not here, who struggle with their faith from time to time. And sometimes we get tired of the squeaky wheel getting the grease, and yet that's exactly what grease is for squeaky wheels. And oftentimes we just get so focused on what my responsibilities are, in the sense of what do I have to do on Sundays, or we get caught up in our lives, that we forget that I owe love to the church. That I have a responsibility to be a part of the church and work in the church on a regular basis. That I have a responsibility to build one another up in love, and I have a responsibility to be here in order to stir you up to love and good works. And that's going to be key. Because the church does not function unless all the parts, as he says here, are working properly. That all the parts are doing well. You know, as great as your vehicle is, if you take out just 3 spark plugs, your car, the whole car, is not going to work well. And yet you think, oh, spark plugs. What you really want is a big old V8 engine. You want a really good transmission. You want all those extra doodads and gizmos, and yet You take out just the smallest things, just 3 spark plugs, and that's it. You're up the creek without a paddle. And yet, so oftentimes we look at ourselves being spark plugs, and well, because I'm not an engine, because I'm not this great, glorious thing that everyone looks at and says, man, that's just the best part of the car, we remove ourselves and fail to realize just how important we are. So I have a few questions for us, the same kind of questions we've been asking for the last couple of weeks. Do you approach others with a mindset that you owe them love? Whenever you get to meet them, either outside of service times or during service or Bible class time, is it the mindset you begin with? Because that is the mindset that Paul encourages us in Romans chapter 13, verse 8. Do you view doing good as an obligation that you have to do on a regular basis? It's kind of a bad way to phrase it, but I think you get my point. That I have an obligation to you to do good. That's one of my purposes in life, is to do good. Do I view that as an obligation and not just a one-time deal? Well, I've done good to John, so John's off my checklist. All I have to do is just go down through the next 25 checklist. What do I have to do? Is that a responsibility that I get to do on a regular basis? Do you premeditate how to stir up one another with love and good works? Premeditation is it's almost always in my mind associated with murder, but that is the point that we're getting at. Do you premeditate how to stir one another up to love and good works? Because each person's going to be different. The way that I'm going to stir somebody up to love and good works is not necessarily going to be the same way that I stir up somebody else. What is encouraging to one person may be discouraging, or may be almost nothing at all to them. And to be able to do that effectively, it's going to take some forethought to do so. Do you neglect the assembly? And do you neglect your obligations towards the church? Do you view building up others as your responsibility instead of looking at it somebody else? So, as a side note, I have a challenge for you guys, but as a side challenge, consider the people that maybe haven't been here in a few weeks. Consider the people that we have an open door to, where we get to encourage them to love and good works. And ask yourself, have you called them or tried to visit them or even text them or email them? Have you contacted them and tried to stir them up to love and good works in the last month? And if not, have we been neglecting our responsibility? I think in the back of our mind we kind of have a list of people that we know on Sunday morning they're going to be here. And if we have a get-together outside of services, they're probably going to be a part of that. And when Wednesday night comes around, if at all possible, they're going to make it. And then we have a secondary list of people who are occasional. Have you called or texted or emailed or tried to visit them? Have you invited them out to coffee or grab lunch somewhere or to go watch a movie? Have you tried to do something with them outside of services in order to fulfill your responsibility of owing them love, or building them up, or encouraging them, or stirring them up? And if not, then I would highly suggest taking some time this week. One of the great things about our society is that we get to communicate so easily with people, that we get to travel from one place to another really quickly, really fast, on really nice highways. And getting to do those things shouldn't be that big of an effort. It's just being mindful and understanding our responsibilities. If we want to enjoy all the blessings of being a part of the church, we also have to understand our responsibilities towards the church. So my challenge this week is to take some time and ask yourself, how have you been doing when it comes to your responsibilities? Lord willing, next week we'll talk about the work and what each of us get to do. But consider your responsibilities this week and ask, have I done them? Could I give to God an honest report of the good that I have done for my relationships in the church, and Him be satisfied with that? The song that Dennis has picked out is number 488. If there's anything we can do for you, if there's any encouragement, if there's any way we can help you to fulfill our responsibility towards you, please let us know as we stand and sing number 488.
Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Thou art the potter, I am the clay. Mold me and make me Lord, wash me just now, as in thy presence humbly I bow. Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Wounded and weary, help me, I pray. Power of power, surely is thine. Touch me and heal me, Savior divine. Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Whole of my being, absolute sway. Fill with thy spirit, till all shall see